Which of the following measures would most likely be necessary for a country with a high capital per labor to increase the growth in its GDP? Is it A, increased capital, B, increased productivity, or C, increased growth in technology? So between these three, we already have high capital, so it's unlikely that increasing capital more is going to increase our growth in GDP. And that's because there's diminishing returns to that capital. You can only put so much capital into something where, to the point where that growth rate is going to drop off. So then between increased productivity and increased growth in technology, increased productivity is generally going to occur already when we have high capital per labor. That's what the capital is going after. It's going into investment in equipment and employees and people in the economy, etc. And it's going into increasing their productivity. So if we already have high capital per labor, it's unlikely that increasing capital is going to grow our GDP. And it's also unlikely that we're going to be able to increase productivity just from the high capital. However, what we can do is we can invest in technology. If we grow technology, then we're going to be able to also increase our productivity. So that's going to make C our best answer here. Consider the following annual returns. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 return streams here, all of them positive. The resulting geometric and arithmetic mean returns are closest to. So we're going to be doing two calculations here. We need to calculate geometric mean and arithmetic mean. Remember, geometric mean is going to be our compounded return. So we're going to do 1 plus each of these return streams and then multiply that to the subsequent return stream. So it'll look like 1.03 times 1.056 and so on and so forth. If any of these were negative, then that would be subtracted from the 1. But these are all going to be positive, so it'll be 1 plus. They'll all be greater than 1. Let's bring this down here. Okay, so for our geometric, again, like I said, we have 1.034, which was added to 1, and then 5.6 added to 1, and so on down the line. And then to annualize this at the end, you go to the nth root. So since we have 5 return streams, we're going to do to the 5th power, or the 1/5 power, the 5th root. And that's going to give us 0.0479 or 1.0479, subtract out 1 and multiply by 100 to get our percentage of 4.79%. So we see we have that in A and B, so we can rule out C. And then for arithmetic, the biggest difference here is we're just taking all these and doing a simple average. So we're just going to divide by 5. So it's just all these return streams added up, gives us 4.82%. So that's going to line up between A and B. That's going to line up with answer B. 4.79 on geometric and 4.82 on arithmetic. Veronica Rose borrowed $5,000 from ContraBank. The terms and conditions of the loan are given in the following table. So we have a loan amount short term for $5,000, 3 years, 3 equal payments, 3%, and no prepayment penalty, meaning that we can pay this off sooner if we want to. However, Rose decides to make a $2,000 payment at the end of the first year, so that would likely be some prepayment there. The amount of each payment required for the remaining 2 years to pay off the remains of the loan are closest to. So we're going to be using time value of money calculation here. We could get the time value of money calculation for this whole thing, but the first thing we need to do is there was likely some prepayment here. So we're going to apply this $2,000 payment to our loan, take into account the interest that we're going to pay, and then we'll figure out the exact amount that we need to pay for this remaining 2 years based on the time value of money calculation. So our outstanding loan at the end of year 1, first we need to figure out the interest we're going to pay. So we have 3% rate, $5,000. So that interest rate, or the amount of interest we're going to pay, is going to be $1,500. So that's going to take our loan balance. If we paid $2,000, we'll do $5,000 minus $2,000, but then we're going to add back $150 because that will not be principal that we paid down. So essentially we paid down $1,850 of principal. So our remaining loan balance is going to be this $3,150. From here, let's bring in our calculator, and we can go ahead and punch these numbers in and calculate the remaining payment. So we're going to use 2 for our n, 3 for interest rate, and our present value is going to be this 3150 number. So I'll have 3150. Our payment is what we'll solve for. This is the amount that we need to pay and the amount we need to pay to get it down to 0 for our future value. So we do that compute payment and we get 164622. These are all pretty close together, so we had to be precise here, and that's going to be answer A. Which of the following is the most appropriate explanation of a -1 correlation between two random variables? A, both variables move together in a negative direction. B, there is no correlation between two random variables. Or C, the movement in one variable will result in the exact opposite proportional movement in the other variable. So this is going to be answer C, and I'll draw a graph down here to show why. If there was no correlation, the correlation would be 0. And if both variables moved together, even if it was in a negative direction, the correlation would be 1. So we can rule those out for that reason. A -1 implies that we're moving in the exact opposite direction. So if we had, let's say, two variables moving together over time, essentially what that's going to mean is this one goes up. Let's say this is stock returns or something like that. This one is going to do the exact opposite. So maybe it starts up here and it goes down and then up. Kind of ends up looking like the DNA symbol, and then it goes down. And we can see it's going to track exactly the opposite. So when this one goes up, this one's going to go down, and so on and so forth. That'll be our -1 correlation, which is, other ways to put it, our perfectly negative correlation or something like that. Answer C. As the sample size increases, the standard error of the sample mean is most likely to A, increase, B, decrease, or C, remains unchanged. So we can bring in an example to show this from a formula standpoint. So this is our formula. Standard error of the sample mean is going to be our standard deviation, and then we're dividing by the square root of n. So here we have square root of n of 20, and we get a value of 1.118. And then when we increase that, we have n of 50. That's going to lower our standard error of the sample mean. So as sample size increases, that's going to lead to B, a decrease in the sample mean. And if you think about this more conceptually too, as we get a higher number of sample, there should be less error from the population, because as we get a higher number of people or samples or observations in our work, it's going to get closer and closer to that population, so that mean should continue to shrink as we get more observations. Answer B. Which of the following is least likely an example of non-state actors in geopolitics? So least likely, so we're looking for a state actor, because we'll have two non-state actors and one state actor. So we've got A, Coca-Cola, B, the Malaysian Parliament, or C, the CEO of Microsoft. So the one that stands out here is going to be B, the Malaysian Parliament, Coca-Cola, and Microsoft. While this one is an individual and this one's a company, these are both going to be non-state actors. They're not part of any country or sovereignty or anything like that. Answer B. Profit maximization conditions for firms under imperfect competition is. So is it A, marginal revenue greater than marginal cost, and total revenue equals total costs? So under these conditions, if our marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, we are by definition not maximizing profits. And this also wouldn't make sense if our marginal revenue was greater than marginal cost and then our total revenue is less than or is equal to total cost. We're not making any profit under this scenario. But under this portion, this would be telling us that we should keep producing, because if I produce another unit, it might only cost me $1, but then I can sell it for $2. That's what this is saying here. So we'll rule out A. B, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, that sounds better so far, because this means if I produce an additional unit, I'm not going to make any more money off of that. So I've exhausted the amount of units that I can be making to make the most profit. And then we have total revenue minus total cost is at its maximum. That is profit. total revenue minus total cost, that's our profit. So if that's at a max, this sounds like B will be our answer. And C, marginal revenue equals marginal costs. That's good, again, same as answer B. But then here we have total revenue minus total cost is at its minimum. We don't want this to be at its minimum, we want it to be at its maximum because that is our profit. Answer B, a certificate of deposit pays you 8% per year, compounded annually. You can reinvest the interest at the same rate for the duration of the CD with no withdrawals. The amount of money you will have at the end of 4 years if you invest $100,000 currently is closest to. All right, so there's 2 ways that we can solve this. Let me bring this over. So one is we can do time value money calculation, and I'll pull that up and we can punch in the numbers, but it's pretty straightforward. So we're compounding for 4 years at 8%. We'll have a present value of what we started at, 100,000, payment of 0, and then we'll compute that future value, and we get 136,048. We can see that corresponds to answer B. An easier way to do this in the situation where there's no coupon payments is you can just compound this forward at the interest rate forward at 4 years, multiplied by that number, or multiply by the starting deposit value, and you can see we get that same number, 136,048.90 once we round that up. Answer B, which of the following statements is least accurate regarding the properties of log-normal distributions? So we've got least accurate, so 2 of these will be properties. So we've got A, log-normal distributions are skewed to the right. That is going to be an accurate statement, so we can rule that out. Log-normal distribution is normally going to look something like this, where you have this as 0, and it's going to kind of hump up like this, and then it's going to have this long right tail. So skewed to the right is what that looks like. B, log-normal distributions can take negative values. This sounds like it's going to be our answer since they cannot take negative values. We're normally using this in the case of something like asset prices where the price can actually go negative. And so you could take the return stream from an asset, which can be negative, but then to convert that into the asset prices, and it would need to be log-normal. And then C, log-normal distributions are more often used than standard distributions to model asset prices. That's also going to be accurate because of what we've already said for B, where the prices can't go negative. So this is a common use for asset prices because you can't have negative asset prices. Answer B, an investor consults an investment manager to advise him regarding a certain portfolio that would give him at least a 7% return on his investment. That's his threshold return. The investment manager presents 3 portfolios exhibited in the following table. So we have portfolios A, B, and C and their expected returns and standard deviations. Using the safety first ratio assumption, the portfolio that is most suitable for the investor is. So our safety first ratio is going to be kind of similar to the Sharpe ratio, except we're using a minimum return threshold, which we're given at 7%. We're going to subtract out return of the portfolio or expected return, so this top row. Then we're going to subtract out the minimum return and then divide by standard deviation. So essentially what this is doing is calculating the amount of risk per unit above our threshold. So we don't necessarily need more return above our threshold. So if we're going to take risk above our threshold, we want that to be lower. And a lower risk relative to that return above the threshold is going to lead to a higher safety first ratio. And that's what we're going to want to go with for this answer. So we calculate that for A, B, and C, and we see that A is the highest at 0.8571. So pretty straightforward. We will go with answer A.